Something that people have been asking me for some help with is to more or less what to look for in gear, like how it starts to utilize and such. And I think that a good way to build an understanding of that is if you know how damage rating, criticals, and brutals all work and interact with each other. So I have a character here who has nothing equipped at all, aside from this pet that adds nothing. And you can pretty much zero it out. Now, if I go ahead and equip this legendary, which adds 2000 mental damage, you can see that quoting this tooltip, it increases base damage by 50%. Mathematicians among you might know that that is a 40 to 1 ratio. 40 damage rating equals 1%, and that is a linear scale. It's always going to be 40 to 1. Now, if you look at the tooltips, this is 24 not 2 and 36 not 3. At this 50% here, these have increased by exactly 50%. So, now that you understand that 40 damage rating is where you get 1% from, let's look at criticals and brutals. By default, you have a 10% chance to crit and no chance to get a brutal. Now, you may be wondering though, why do I have 240 critical damage if I have nothing equipped? Well, that's because these attributes right here, these actually do increase your stats. Namely, this 240 is coming from the intelligent stat 4 times 60, 240. Probably worth noting though that if you equip something that does add intelligence, it doesn't actually boost your stats any. That's still 240, it's not 420 like you'd expect. But I go ahead and point that out anyway, because this is normally 150% base. I'm getting 3% extra from the 240. Critical damage is an 80 to 1 ratio. 80 critical damage gets you 1%. Now, brutal damage starts at 300%. When I mass over this number, it's 303%. Why is that when I don't have any here? Well, that's because you have to understand that a brutal strike is when a critical hit rules a critical itself. So that means that this critical damage here also scales up your brutal damage. This 3% is being carried over to here. This is a 3% increase. It's a 1-to-1 increase. You can see this further illustrated if I go ahead and equip this legendary. This adds 3000 critical damage. Now you can see that even though my brutal damage is still 0, this is now 190. It's 40% increase. This is also a 40% increase. So for those of you who are trying to build for brutals, because you like those big chunky red numbers, do not neglect this stat right here, your critical damage, because that is also going to scale up your brutal damage. And it's worth pointing out that the inverse is not true. If I equip this legendary, that's 10,000 brutal damage. I'm getting plus 125%. This is still at 153. This also shows that 80 brutal damage also gets you 1%. So now you kind of know that 1 damage rating is equal to roughly 2 critical damage and 2 brutal damage, at least on paper. Do understand though that these are, your criticals and your brutals are percentage based, and also your critical damage is scaling up this. So if you go ahead and do the maths behind that, I believe that it's actually not quite 2 to 1, but 0.6 roughly damage rating is equal to roughly
Just thinking about the
1
worst that
critical
could happen
damage.
makes me want to gouge out
And
my
about half of
eyes.
that, 0.3 I would say, damage rating is about equal to 1 brutal damage. Admittedly, I've not done the maths behind that. So, one more thing to start this right quick. I'm gonna go ahead and switch to Punisher. And we're gonna throw on all of this brutal strike gear right here. Leaving us in the nullifier. Now, the reason why I'm using Punisher is because we even have an extra brutal chance here. This is going to be 28.3% brutal chance. So you'd think that if I start attacking this dummy, you're going to see roughly about 1 in 4. Over 1 in 4 of these is going to be brutal. What's actually happening in practice here? This is nowhere near 1 in 4. They're popping up somewhat sporadically, but this is nowhere near what seems like 28%. Why is that? Well, remember what I said earlier. A brutal strike is when a critical hit crits. This 28.3% is not 28.3% chance to get a brutal. The way it works is that when you get a critical hit, then this number rolls. So it's really 28.3% of this number right here, your critical hit, to have 10%. So really my brutal strike chance is only about 3%. It's rather abysmal. I'll equip a few things here that add some critical hit. This is now 28.8. This is still 28.3. And I start attacking. I'm going to notice that the crits are far more frequent. Also, for the most part, you're going to see the brutals pop up more reliably as well. So, you have to sort of keep that in mind. That your critical stats, both the critical hit and your critical damage, are going to scale up your brutal strike and your brutal damage. And if you use those sorts of rough ratios, roughly 0.6 for critical damage and 0.3 for brutal, that's sort of like a rough ballpark on how different things compare. So when you see something like an insignia that has plus 400 damage, or you can get plus 1000 critical damage on it, that plus 1000 critical damage is going to give you far more overall because of the conversion. It's going to of course matter and come down to like what this number and what this number or how likely you are to crit and brute. But you can use this as sort of like a basic guideline. Anyway, I do hope that helps.